Great. Okay. Let's just need to check the time. Yeah, it's 11:30. And I think most people are, well, I can't tell whether they're back because it's a coffee break, so they may well be still having coffee, but let's start anyway, since we've got a tight schedule. So it's my real pleasure to have Carl-Henrik Eck visit us virtually from Cambridge. I was just in Cambridge, and Carl organized an amazing event in a very fancy Cambridge college. So we can't match that, Carl, with this Zoom meeting, I'm afraid. It's not quite the same, but I think the science will be good anyway. Carl has been actually working on multimodal data integration for a while, and I think he gave a talk in Manchester quite a long time ago on this kind of topic and the difficulties of mixing different data sets with very different dimensionalities and so on, which can be a real kind of challenge in machine learning. So it's my pleasure to have Carl here, and he's going to talk about latent variable models for multimodal data. Over to you, Carl.
Thank you very much, Magnus. It's a pleasure. I wish I would be up in Manchester. So I spent a considerable amount of my PhD in the Kilburn building. And I would know, if you have the same weather as me, the Kilburn building would be about 45 degrees warm at the moment. So actually, the interesting thing is that a lot of this work and a lot of these thoughts around this topic actually stems from that time. So I think this is a really, really interesting topic. So what I thought I'll do is to give a bit of a, rather than giving a talk, this is the model that you should use, here's all the math for it, I thought I'll give a little bit of a flavor of what is the difference of how to think about multimodal data compared to when we don't. And in a way, we'll come to what I think is a generalization. We should always think of data as multimodal as long as it's multivariate. So what are we going to talk about today? Well, basically, we're going to talk about apples and oranges, right? So the notion, the way I think about multimodal data is that we have some form of measurements of the world, but we got them of different types. And what we have is that we got some form of underlying phenomena which we're interested in thinking about. And this is maybe the first point that I really want to push on. And that is the point of a goal, right? So everything that we do when we're doing integration of especially multimodal data is that we need to have a task in order to say how well we're doing. And if we don't have this task, the problem kind of becomes pointless, right? So there's really two ways of thinking about this. And the way I think about it is in terms of the word re-representation. So the way I think about it is that we got these apples and oranges, right? Which are these measurements of this thing that we want to think about. And they are clearly in a representation, in some form of representation, based on how we measure them. And what we want to do now is, when we think about this in a latent variable setting, is that we want to re-represent the data, so restructure the data in one way or the other, so that the new structure that we get, we can benefit from each of the modalities to achieve this goal. So the first notion that I would think about when thinking about this problem in this way is something like this, right? So I got my apples and oranges and I got my goal, right? And it's the thing in between that I want to figure out. So if I do this, I would then start removing the stuff that is not interesting for the goal itself. So to make jam, I'll remove the seeds or the kernels. I'll probably remove some peel and so forth. And then hopefully I'll aim to go to the goal, right? And I hope that that jam representation is better. So the other notion, which might seem a bit counterintuitive because it feels like a lot harder problem, would be to think about it in this way instead. So effectively, I just alter these arrows. And what I mean with these arrows will roughly become clear later on, I think. So in this setting, what I do is that I say, no, in order to figure out my goal, I want to learn everything about apples. I want to understand what apples are, and I want to understand what oranges are. But I'm going to allow myself the freedom to structure that information however way I want. And if I do that, then I can go to the goal. And if we say, so in this setting, you would actually learn everything about the peel as well. So this seems like a much harder problem. So why would one want to be interested in doing this? So my argument for, or my thesis in this talk is basically the jam is bad for you, right? So I'm going to argue that doing the first thing, which we often do, is actually can lead to very, very negative things. And this is especially true if you're working in data domains where only a small proportion of what you measure are relevant for the problem that you're trying to solve. So let me give you an example. And now Magnus might think that I've completely lost it because I'm going to continue with an analogy that I used when he was down here. So we're going to talk about sport. So in this case, we got images from multiple different sports. It's these 3 sports: cricket, croquet, and lacrosse. And our task is to figure out and classify each image to which sport it belongs. So let's start off with the jam procedure. Well, what we can figure out, what the task will tell us, is that actually these sports can all be differentiated by the tool that you use to play them. So what we do is we try to design an algorithm that throws away everything else so that we get out this, this tool. And from this tool, it's a very, very easy representation, right, to get to these 3 labels, right? Super simple. Okay? So that seems like a very sensible thing to do. However, what happens if we now see this, right? So now in our modeling procedure, or algorithmic procedure in this case, we have designed something that extracts these 3 things. And that is definitely a cricket bat, but it's definitely not cricket. So what happens now is that this approach will clearly super well tell you the representation that we've learned, great, this is cricket. So if we then go to the approach that I try to argue for, that we say we actually learn everything about these images to begin with, we would have something like this instead, right? So we would say that these images can be parameterized by their tools and by lots of other stuff, right? This stuff that we threw away. In this case, we keep this because we build a model that uses this. And in this case, if we end up seeing this image, we've also understood that all the sports that we looked at are played on grass. And in this image, we have no grass. So even if the tool matches, this stuff, the rubbish or the stuff that we weren't interested in, actually turns out to be incredibly relevant to be able to say something about these classes, right? So now, this is clearly a very, very idealistic setting. And what we're interested in, what's really required for doing these kind of things, is that we need to find these structures that are relevant, right? In this case, I had this very nice separation of everything else plus the thing that was useful for the classification. And that's really going to be the challenge, which is the stuff that I'm really going to try and hint and talk about today. So why do I think that this is such an important or a useful and important way we should look at this problem? So we can think about how the variations is structured in the data that we have to solve a specific problem. So I'm going to classify variations in 4 different ways. And now you might see that this is why we require a goal or a task, because otherwise we can't say anything. It's the goal that allows me to put this semantic on variations in the data. So I say I have some information which are relevant. So this is the information that allows me to say something about the goal. I have some information which is irrelevant. It's something that exists in the data, but it has nothing to no information about the goal. And then I have noise, which is noise. It's something that has to do with the measurements that I've taken. And then I have a fourth part, which we often don't talk about, which is information that exists in the goal, but does not exist in the observation itself. So this is information which is effectively ambiguous. Okay. So now most machine learning data sets and therefore most machine learning algorithms are incredibly heavily curated, right? So that means we've developed methods mainly for this setting, where we say that, you know, basically most of our information is relevant. And then we have a tiny bit of noise, and there's some tiny stuff that's irrelevant. And ambiguous stuff, well, we don't really care too much about that. Then it becomes complicated. So we really assume that that doesn't exist. So this is the setting where most machine learning problems are designed for. However, this is clearly the opposite how the real world looks like, because I think for most things, and especially now when data capture for many scenarios becomes so cheap, most of the information that we have is completely irrelevant for the problem. It's complete nonsense. It doesn't, or it's not nonsense, it's irrelevant for solving the specific task. And we have a huge chunk which is ambiguous, because there's lots in the task we want to solve that doesn't exist in the data, and we have some noise. And now what I tried to hint in the previous setting is that this irrelevant information is actually really, really important to describe so that we're not doing wrong, right? Actually knowing that all these sports were played on grass turns out to be really, really useful. Cool. So what I'm going to do now, that was my slightly longish intro, I'll try to speed up a little bit, is that I'm going to just hint at how some techniques that allows us to look of how we can find these structured latent spaces. To begin with, first, let's just formalize the problem a little bit in terms of this notion of re-representation. So what I'm saying is that we have some observed data Y, and what I want to learn is that I want to learn a re-representation of this data in form of a variable X, and this variable X is connected to the data Y through a mapping F. Right, so let's draw this. So this is the problem that we have. So some people refer to this as unsupervised learning. I think unsupervised learning is a massive misnomer, because if it was unsupervised, that implies you can do whatever you want, right? It's like if your parents told you to go out and play in an unsupervised manner and you set fire to their car, well, they can't really complain, right? If they didn't want that, that's supervision. So the problem that we're trying to address is that we got the stars. So we got stuff on the y-axis, and we have like an abacus frame where we're trying to assign each y value an x value. And we're trying to connect all these things with some form of function, right? So that's one solution, that's another solution, and this here is a third solution, right? So clearly this problem is incredibly ill-posed. Any of these are fine, right? So what we have to do is that we have to include some form of preference to the solution that we want that's disconnected from the data in some way, right? We can do that either algorithmically, which is something that has been done a lot, where we start saying, well, the way I search for solutions somehow has a preference towards specific solutions. Or we can do it what I refer to in a structural manner, where we directly include measures of preference towards specific solutions. And now what I will try to argue for as well is that if we're supposed to interpret the structure that we get out, because it's ill-posed, and the only thing that allows us to get to any solutions is these preferences that we put in, is that if we don't understand the preference, we can't understand the result. So the solution to any machine learning problem can only be interpreted in the light of the preference that we include. So we really want to understand what we put in. If we don't do these things, really bad things can happen. So I'm not sure if you're aware of this paper. I'm pretty sure you've seen some references. I actually read this again after 15 years. So it's the first paper where we often talk about factor analysis. And I realized this paper is basically eugenics. So what this paper says is that experimental psychology has lots of issues because people are not taking the field seriously. So what Charles Spearman said was that I'm going to derive a methodology that allows us to basically be beyond just human judgment of things. This is going to be something that directly extracts factors from data which are indisputable. And the notion was that he wanted to take measurements of very multimodal data, so take measurements of human behavior, and he had ranked these behaviors as stuff that were good and stuff that were bad, and then he could find the latent representation such that the stuff that was important for all these things was a factor called general intelligence. So it's a really scary paper to read when you think about this, because what we've noted to begin with, you can't do this, right? Because the solutions that comes up in this case is only a factor of the preferences that were put into the problem. So what we need to do then, and in this specific case, they were all completely algorithmical and not particularly they were not stated in the work. So what we need to do then is that we need to think about how can we put in supervision for unsupervised learning. This, as you see, is why I dislike the name. So the first notion that we're going to exploit is just this concept which all of us know, which is framed as explaining away, right? So this is the first and easiest way we can get a representation of data that obeys a specific structure. We do this all the time. So the way we should read this plot is that in this case, we often say that epsilon here is noise, right? Noise implies that it's the stuff that we want this term to explain in the data such that it doesn't pollute this. So effectively, epsilon explains away something so that X retains the rest, right? So we don't need to think about this as noise. This could be, this is the thing that explains away everything but the tool that was used to play the 3 different sports, right? And the next thing which we're going to use is that we're going to think about these 2 other terms that we have. So we're going to talk more about how we can encode specific structures, but then we also have this notion of the mapping. So the mapping that generates the data from the latent space is also something where we can encode and input preferences. And the easiest example of this is something that we all know, and that's of course principal component analysis, right? So in principal component analysis, we use it's effectively the factor analysis model of Spearman. However, in this case, you make the preferences very clear, where you say my latent structure is Gaussian and my mapping from this Gaussian latent space is linear, and that leads to PCA. However, now if we gotten this notion of normal unsupervised learning or dimensionality reduction somehow clear, what we were going to talk about was apples and oranges. And the thing was, when you have apples and oranges, it actually makes the problem a lot more interesting. Some people think it's harder, but what we now have is that it adds a semantic to the problem. So I'm going to skip this. So what I'm going to talk about now to show you the semantic that it adds is using an example from this COIL dataset. Because the way we present the data by aligning it allows us to discover specific latent structures. So this is a term, this is supervision by alignment. So hopefully this will become clear. So let's say I take two data sets. So these are now my modes or views of the problem. So on one side, I got ducks, and the other one, I got cats, right? And now what I do is that in every multimodal scenario, you have to say, well, this one and this one is somehow connected to each other, right? They happen at the same time. So now that provides supervision. So if I would learn a latent model of this, there's a very clear structure that appears. So what is common or shared between these two objects is that they're both rotated at the same angle. They're aligned by their rotation. So the concept of rotation is shared between them. However, the appearance of being a duck or a cat is private to the two. So now what you can think about is in different ways like this. You can think about the semantic that the duck and the cat explains away the variations to make a latent variable that contains the remaining thing that's shared. Another way is that I can now align these differently. So what I do is that I align ducks with ducks, but now I put the rotation differently. So this thing now would lead to a representation looking such as this. If I explain away the rotation, these are just cats and dogs, right? So now then, this sounds very useful, right? This sounds like if you can think, for example, of adding in the task that we had before, this would lead to exactly the model that we had. I see a task as just another modality, right? The output of the model, what we want to achieve is just another modality. So what I can do in this setting is that now I would lead me to a factorization that looks something like this, right? I would have the data here, which is the stuff that's irrelevant, because it needs to be explained away to find the things that's shared between the two. I have the stuff here, the stuff that doesn't exist on this side, so it's ambiguous. This needs to be explained away from these labels or the task to get this relevant thing, right? So if you want, you can think about these private things even as noise models, right? With a lot of structure. So my highlight then, or what I want to highlight, is that effectively multimodal data gives rise to these notions of semantic latent spaces. So the notion of information which is private is stuff that's only present in a single view or modality, while the information that's shared is stuff that's present in two or more views of a problem. So what we said was that the private information explains away the data such that the shared representation can be found, right? Cool. So how do we then effectively learn this, right? So I'm not going to go into too much detail because it turns out it's really, really simple. So if you think about this, so let's say I have a 5-dimensional latent space. In this case, I have y1, which is my first modality, and y2. And in this case, they share one in part of the input space, x1. In this case, I need 5 dimensions. They each have 2 that are private. However, if I would be able to somehow rearrange x1 or x2, x4, x5, and x3 and find some more stuff that's shared here, such that I can have 2 shared dimensions and only 1 private each. In that case, I only end up with 4 latent dimensions. So it's very easy to encode a preference towards making things shared, because the only thing you do is that a shared dimension double counts because it represents every modality or a set of modalities. And that means as long as I have a prior that reduces or have a preference to using as few dimensions as possible of my latent representation, I will end up in something of a shared and a private structure. So that means what I need to have, and this is tricky in terms of learning, is that I need to have a model which somehow has an adaptive complexity of the representation. And this is tricky because if you fix the dimensionality, all of your models is always going to use as much as it can. So you need to have something which is adaptable. There are ways of doing that, which is with certain models, but this is something that we really need to have. So what we can do, just to give you, I'm just going to round up here. There are many, many different ways of thinking about how to build these kind of structures, what you put on the different parts of the model and so forth. You can have neural networks doing things, you can have Gaussian processes, you can have linear models and so forth. But this is effectively the structure that I try to highlight. You have your observed data, and then you have your shared data, you have your private representations, and you potentially have some noise that explains away. And all these places are where you need to put in your preference over this problem. So I'm going to give just the last thing, because this is the only paper that I'm going to talk about. So sometimes we just think about multimodal data as in, I have this measurement that is of 200 dimensions that done with this machine, and I have another one which is 5 dimensions with another machine, and then we just concatenate them, and then we say, oh, we say these are the 2 separate things that we should work with. Why is that? Maybe the way we should think about it is that each dimension of the variations are actually themselves a mode that we should think about them completely separately. So we can take this thing, for example. This is a motion capture of a horse that's walking around. Now, let's say that I also had a cow that's walking around or something. Now, why should I split this data into a horse and a cow? Maybe what I should split it in instead is that it turns out that this part of the tail of the horse moves exactly in the same thing as the cow's tail works. And maybe what I actually want to do is that I would want to learn exactly these groupings of the variates. And it turns out you can do this with exactly the same prior that we had before. So you now also, you have a prior of shrinking the latent space, and you let the model be free of grouping the output dimensions in such a way that it can make as much things as possible shared. So I haven't talked much details, but I'll show a little schematic of a model and what the outcome of this is. So the model that we use in this case is a Gaussian process and a Dirichlet process to do some allocation priors. But what effectively happens is that we learn a matrix that looks like this, where I have a latent dimension here, and I have observed dimension here. And what it effectively says is that this dimension here of the observed data is shared with this dimension, and it's shared with this dimension through this latent dimension, and so forth. So you get a complete factorization of the data. And this is a really, really interesting way where you can see what correlates with what. So I'm going to skip that because I ran a little bit out of time. So just then, in summary of what I thought were the key points to take away from this. So learning latent variable models is really, really useful and important because it allows us to actually have this thing where we can be uncertain when we see data that we haven't seen before. Importantly, then we move into the realm of unsupervised learning. And I hope you agree with me, it makes no sense whatsoever if you don't have an objective, if you don't have a task. Your task can be as simple as reduce the dimensions, fine, but then you have a task, right? So always think about what that is. Your task needs to come into it. Now, the setting which we talked about today, which was multimodal data, is that think about it as adding a semantic, right? Think about it as you can use one view or mode as supervision for the other. The alignments that you do provide supervision. Now, how do we input priors? This was the thing I skipped a little bit. The mapping and the structure are interchangeable, right? If you give me the mapping, I can give you the representation. If you give me the representation, I can solve for the mapping. So now we are kind of free to put priors or information on either of them. And it really depends on your problem. Do you know about the generating structure, or do you know about the structure of the input to the mapping? So with that, I am going to finish and hope you have a couple of questions.
Thanks, Carl. And we can do some virtual clapping. Okay, if people have a question for Carl, they can either just unmute and talk, or you can put something in the chat, or you can even raise your hand. Somebody was doing raising hands. So
people raise hand.
People are raising hands to clap, but we need to raise questions. Let's see. Can I differentiate? Sammy's got a question.
Sammy's got a question.
Go for it.
Hi, Carl. Thanks. Great talk. Really thought-provoking. So how far do you think you can take this? You used some words as using preferences that the data is Gaussian, for instance, which I can kind of interpret in some really exciting ways. And you could also think of the sampling function now here. Also looking at the covariances within the same dimension, even if you bring that element in, or I don't know if this makes sense, but this is something that I haven't thought of, that extension of generalization, but you clearly have. So it would be great to hear your thoughts, but maybe Magnus needs to stop this session at some point. We'll have another chat.
Yeah, so this is actually so the next thing that we try to do, and this has been my pet project for about 10 years. And that is, I also want to be Bayesian about the alignment. So can I actually integrate out the permutation of the data? And now, as anyone who's worked with permutations are like the worst mathematical object in the world. They grow super exponential and it's all horrible. And we have very little ways of thinking about distributions over permutations. If anyone knows this, please let me know. But so what we would want to do is effectively have this matrix that we had here, but also over permutations. So I can say, oh, if I align this with this, and I think this is really important, because you often have data which is captured out of sync, right? Or I even want to be able to say, I got these two data sets, they're completely unstructured. Can you actually align them for me? And this could be a way of actually aligning the data, because you know there is some context in this where I believe they should share as much as possible. That's a really sensible way of aligning them. Now, we have done this in a iterative maximum likelihood horrible way, and it works. But of course, well, we do it as simple as this. You greedily add 1 point and you check where it should be. So, and it gives you, it can recover permutations, but it's of course, you know, it becomes impossible for larger data sets. So that's one thing that I think is really interesting. And especially if you've got like some weak timestamps or some, you know, out of frequency sampling, then you could have a really strong prior on the permutations. Like you can shuffle a little bit, right? So I think that would be really cool. But it's a project that's so strange, so I don't dare to put a PhD student on it because it feels like you would run into a wall.
Many thanks. Hopefully we'll have a chance to continue on this.
Yeah, exactly.
Ting-Ting's got a question.
Yeah. So first, I worked on permutation with my collaborators.
Oh, fantastic!
The way we approach it is not by learning distribution of a permutation vector. That is, we relax the permutation vector to real valued vector, and then we approach it from pure optimization protocol.
You do doubly stochastic matrices.
Yeah, exactly. That's the way.
Exactly. Yeah, it's just that the number of vertices of that simplex grows quite quickly.
Yes. Different relaxation just can give you easy solution or make your life like hell. But yeah. So, but this is not my question. My question is actually it's about the beginning of your talk. I found it very interesting. Your example you used about the tool and then inject some useful information to get perhaps better inference for less straightforward task. But then we all know that, say you can find these key tools and then you make a prediction, then you can get high accuracy in easy tasks. But then when you aim at learning useful information, then we can do better in terms of more difficult tasks, but there is a trade-off.
Yeah.
So the accuracy for the easy task could probably drop. And we already seen it in like zero-shot learning or few-shot learning.
Yeah.
So my question to you is, what's your view and the perception on this?
Yeah, that's a very good question. So I think this probably says a little bit about the problems that I've generally been working in, where we got quite small volumes of data. Generally, D is a lot higher than N. And I don't know if it's because I work on models that can't really use much data, or it is that I'm interested in small data problems. And then we really require these things, right? We have to do it in this way. And now there is a question of, can I overcome this with data? Well, of course you can, but to me, it's very, very hard. And I always ask this when I go out and work on a domain. What is a lot of data? Like when is the data set that you have actually, you know, an empirical good estimate of the underlying distribution? And if you can't say that, then we always run into this problem where we might get exactly these issues, right? But if I knew I had sufficient data, well, this would be fine, right? Then it's just a feature selection problem. But I actually don't think most of the time it is. So the question is then, sorry if I keep reading. The question is, if we are in this scenario, if I spend 90% of my modeling effort modeling this and this and this, I'm wasting a lot of effort for getting out this. And you can then have to balance the model to try and potentially spend more effort here, or tuning your data set to try and remove some of this stuff and things like that. And that becomes the practical challenges. So we're always going to be worse, most likely, except for the fact that when we have small amounts of data, right? Because then I can often at least say, I don't think this is a good classification. Yeah, but it's a super good question.